Welcome to Titan Wargaming. Today we're going to be turning this into this. This project actually started out of quarantine. My daughter had COVID. I really had an urge to get the bases on my Outriders done, but I couldn't pick up any more hobby supplies. So I rummaged around the kitchen, around the laundry, to see what I could find, what I already had here from other hobby endeavours, and tried to come up with a base that I thought would suit the Outrider squads that had been patiently waiting since Indomitus came out to be painted.
I may have designed this technique for the Outriders from Indomitus, but these bases here are 70mm 3D printed bases that I'm going to be using for attack bikes. Attack bikes don't normally come with bases, but I find they just suit the army better if you've got a base that matches the rest of the army. To get started, we've grabbed a sheet of the sponge cloth. I'm just going to roughly measure out how much we're going to need for the base. Quickly chop that up, and then we can start working on actually forming what's going to be the road. Now with the circle we've cut out, that's roughly the same size as the base, we're going to start breaking this down even further into the chunks of the road that are going to be on the base. Some of these will be a little bit big and hang off the edge, just because we're making gaps, but we can always fix that up later once everything's glued down and dried. As we're cutting it out, we're just going to make sure that, yes, the pieces go together roughly okay. The gap we want to try and keep under, I think it's 1/4 of an inch, so about 5mm, just so that we can have it look like it's not too damaged. This is a good point to actually spend a little bit of extra time on. The more work you put in here in making sure the gaps are okay and the lines are okay, the better things will turn out in the end. And once we're reasonably happy with how the layout's looking, there's not too many sharp edges, there's some spots where there's gaps, we're going to come in and just stick everything down with some PVA glue. You can try super glue or hot glue. I prefer to use PVA glue because it will soak into the sponge better. With the PVA dried, we're just going to come around and trim the edges of the bases so that it doesn't overhang too much. A little bit of overhang can be okay, but I prefer to try and trim it as flush as I can. Next up is possibly the two most important steps, and that is the 2 layers of Mod Podge that are going to go over the sponge. This is going to soak right into the sponge, and as the Mod Podge dries it's going to harden up a little bit, which is going to give you a little more stability on the foam, and it'll stop things compressing quite so much. The Mod Podge I'm using is just the Mod Podge matte. I've mixed in some cheap craft paint so that I can see what's going on a little better. Once I do let this dry, it does come up actually rather dark grey colour. That's completely accidental. You do need to make sure you let this dry at least overnight. The longer you can let it dry, up to about 24 hours fully, will let it be a little more hard and a little more stable when you're doing the finished product. Even after the first coat is fully dry, the porous nature of the sponge will help soak up a little bit more of that, and we're looking to get the full saturation of the Mod Podge to make this as hard as possible. After I've let the second coat fully cure, I've come in with an airbrush to prime this. I did also test if spray primers would damage the sponge in any way, and it was perfectly fine to use a spray can, or you can just paint the primer on by hand, it's up to you. The first of the main colours that I'm going to lay down is Mechanicus Standard Grey from Games Workshop. If you've got your favourite concrete recipe, just use that, but I'll be using my favourite recipe in this video. We're going to fill up the cracks and crevices of the base with some texture paste. I'm using Astro Granite here, but whichever grey one you've got should be fine. You can leave some spots that aren't completely filled in and put tufts in there later. I've done that on a couple of these bases as well, you'll see that in the end. After I've filled the cracks, just before I let everything dry, I'm going to wipe down the surface with some paper towel, just to make sure there's not too much of the heavy debris and grit there. Some of the pigment from the texture paste may stain, but that's completely fine. By the time we wash it, that'll all vanish. speaking of the wash, Agrax Earthshade is my go-to earth wash. Whichever one you want to use is going to be completely fine here, it doesn't matter. You just need to make sure you're covering the entire base, which will help blend in any parts where the texture paste is a slightly different colour. Again, I've left the shade to dry overnight just to make sure it's all completely fine, and then I'm going to start with the dry brushes. And the first dry brush I'm going to do is to come in with Dawnstone. I want to put this one on pretty heavy, and then we'll come back in with a lighter dry brush of Kislev Flesh, just to help add some more definition to the edges and the cracks. You can see here that even being rather light with the Kislev Flesh, it does really pick up well on those edges and help add some extra depth to the base itself. The part that's really going to sell this as being a road is going to be the markings. So I've laid out some masking tape here. I've again left about 1/4 of an inch, 5mm gap between the two. Then I'm going to bridge the two with some more masking tape to make a dashed line going up the road. There are a couple of different ways you can add the colour to the marking itself. I've seen people stipple it on with a paintbrush. I'm using a piece of black foam here that came in some models from Privateer Press. Games Workshop metal models used to have a similar thing. You could use natural sponge, dish sponge, anything that's going to leave a stippled effect on the surface. The colour I've picked for the markings is Flash Gets Yellow from Games Workshop. Of course, you're going to customise this based on whatever road you're trying to make. You've just got to be careful not to add too much paint here. You want to be able to see some of the road through the marking still. Once you peel back the tape, it's up to you whether you call the base done here, or whether you go on to add some extra details in like I've done. I raided my basing box and found some bricks and stones here that I can use for the bases. I've also got some tufts that I can add in as well. These are bricks from a company called Jawila, I believe. I'm not sure, I ordered them off eBay a couple of years ago, so they're there, I might as well use them. You don't need to add a lot of this rubble to each base, just something to break up the colour palette a little bit. I'm just going to fix these down with some super glue. You can, depending on the glue, get a slightly glossy finish on the area where you've glued. To fix that, I'm going to come back in with some Lamian medium just over that area, and that'll help matte things down. You could also use whichever matte varnish you've got around. Same thing with the tufts. The ones that are in the cracks, you can normally just push in and allow the glue that's on the tuft to hold it in place. But if I'm sitting it on the surface, I try and super glue it down, because otherwise there's a chance that with gameplay it will just come off. When you do come back in to matte down the area with the Lamian medium, I find it's best to do the entire section of the road that the super glue is on, just so that there's not any tide marks or anything like that on the finished product. To blend the rubble a little bit more and to add a little bit of depth to the red on the bricks, I do come through with a wash of Agrax Earthshade. I'm not going to worry about a highlight or a dry brush for this, it's just going to be put a wash on, let it dry, and that'll be fine. Washes don't always want to stick to the little rocks that are on there, but that's just adding a little more variation into it, so it should be okay. And of course, the final step for these bases and any other base you're doing is to paint the rim. I pretty much always go with a black, sometimes you're going to add squad markings etc. on the bases. You know what you're doing for your army, just follow that.
And there you go, cheap, easy road bases. If you enjoyed the video, please like, comment and subscribe. I'm not sure what project I'll be working on next, but in the meantime, have a good one.